Welcome to this course on practical API hacking. I'm really excited to be here on this journey with you. Now, I'll keep this intro fairly short, but I just wanted to share a few things before we started. First up, who am I? Well, my name is Alex. I started my career as a developer and then moved into the cybersecurity space around 8 or 9 years ago and have basically been working in and around web application security for most of that time. I'm not really a fan of listing off certain things, so if you'd like to know more about me, then of course feel free to connect on LinkedIn or drop into the TCM Discord or one of our live streams. Now, I designed this course with a few things in mind. First of all, you shouldn't need much prior experience to take on this course. Ideally, you've done a little bit of web hacking before, but don't fret if you're still a beginner. Secondly, I wanted to try and remove a lot of the complexity that web applications bring to learning, especially around technologies that you might not be familiar with. So to do this, I've tried to break down the attacks into simple concepts and demonstrations that we can then build on. I'm a big believer in understanding what's happening under the hood, rather than just showing you payloads that you can then copy and paste. Third, there are 2 capstone challenges, one in the middle of the course and one at the end of the course. The middle one is designed to test you against a developer that has cobbled together different pieces of functionality to create a functioning application, but doesn't yet have the skills to architect an elegant solution. You'll find many mistakes, not just from an API security perspective, but also from outdated practice and inexperience. The final capstone is a little bit more solid and more of a well-rounded application, and you'll get a chance to explore and uncover vulnerabilities that APIs have to offer. We also make use of some open source labs throughout the course to give you some extra practice and demonstrate certain vulnerabilities in more complex situations. And my advice is to watch the videos in order, take notes, and follow along as much as possible. Make sure you have a good stab at the challenges in each section, and don't beat yourself up too much if you don't manage to get all of them. Just make sure to update your notes and consider what you'd do differently next time once we've walked through the solution. And finally, if you run into any trouble with your environment, your first point of call should be Google. Basic troubleshooting skills are super important in our industry, so take every chance to improve them. But if you do find yourself stuck and you need further support, don't hesitate to reach out to us. I'll leave some links in this section for you. If you like the course and want to keep in touch, you can follow TCM and myself on LinkedIn for updates, or just come hang out on the TCM Discord server. Unsurprisingly, I tend to hang out in the web apps chat section, so feel free to drop in and say hi. All right, good luck, and I hope you enjoy. All right, one last thing before we jump into the course. This is our Discord server, and whenever you need support, this is the place to go. Even if you put a ticket in, this is likely where you'll be directed to, as our staff can easily support you here. To join, you just need to go to https://discord.gg/TCM. Now, once you're in and you've accepted the server rules, you can just scroll down to start here. And what you want to do is click the upside down smiley face, which is underneath the Join Practical API Hacking Support. Once you've done this, you'll have a channel. So if we keep scrolling down, and you'll see this Academy Private PAH. And we have 2 channels in here. So we have the course chat PAH, and as you can see, somebody has already posted in there as this course went live today. And we also have the course suggestions as well. Now, you're welcome to come in and chat in this channel if you're stuck on something, if you need hints, or if you want advice on maybe where to go next or how to tackle one of the challenges. And you're also welcome to post course suggestions in the suggestions tab as well. And aside from that, the Discord has over 50,000 people and is generally a great place to hang out, learn new things, help out other people, and be part of the community. Now, I tend to hang out down here in the web apps chat, so feel free to come in and say hi. But of course, there are plenty of channels for whatever you're working on. Let's dive into the course. API stands for Application Programming Interface, And in simple terms, APIs allow us to connect applications together. It sets the rules for which two entities can share information, almost like a mediator between one application and another. So if we think about an application, it's made up of lots of smaller pieces of code that do things and return some results. APIs allow us to connect these smaller pieces of code or applications together to create a larger application. For example, your phone may want to display the weather in your location and display an alert if you're likely to need an umbrella on your commute today. To do this, the application needs to know two things. Firstly, where you are, and secondly, what is the weather at that location. Your application can use API calls to gather this information, process it, and display the results for you. In this case, all the developer has to worry about is handling the information that comes back and the logic of calculating the umbrella alerts. They don't need to go out and build weather stations and create their own proprietary weather models or ask the user where they are. To give a more abstract example, my favorite so far is the restaurant. You have a menu and the kitchen prepares your food. Your waiter is the link between you and the kitchen. They are in fact the API. They take your order and return with the food. Everything that happens in the kitchen is hidden, which is called abstraction, and means that we don't actually need to worry about how the kitchen does its job, just as long as we get the response, in this case the food we ordered, back. We'll talk more about abstraction a little bit later on. That's it for this video, and in the next one we'll be taking a closer look at some hands-on examples and how we interact with APIs. See you in the next video. In this video, we're going to take a quick look at some API endpoints so that we can get familiar with what to expect and how to interact with those API endpoints. You don't need to follow along right now. In the next section, we'll go through setting up, configuring, and how to use all of the tools that I'm about to show you, but this is just a hands-on demo to help you visualize the theory that we've talked about. So here we are at the catfacts API or catfacts.ninja API. And we have some documentation here, and it gives us two main sections. One is the breeds and one is the facts. So we can click into these to see which endpoints exist. And the easiest way to get some data from an API endpoint is simply to browse to it. So if we look at this /fact, it returns a random fact. So all I'm going to do is copy this URL, paste this, and go to /fact and see what comes back. And if I zoom in a little bit, we have the fact, Abraham Lincoln loved cats. He had 4 of them while he lived in the White House. I didn't know that, so that's quite cool. We also get back this length as well. And if we come back to the documentation here, we do have this max length parameter. So within the documentation, it's telling us that we can specify a max length. So I'm just going to copy this, come back to the facts, and then add this as a parameter and hit enter. And we can see that indeed the fact that's passed back, cats have supersonic hearing, is a length of 28, so less than 30 that's specified. And if we hit enter again, we get a different one, and all of them are less than 30. Another way we can interact with API endpoints is through Burp Suite. So I already have this set up and ready to go, and in the next section, I'll show you how to get this set up as well. And we just come into Burp Suite, we come into proxy, HTTP history, and you can see actually the requests that I've sent already. And I'm just going to move myself out of the way. Here we go. And you can see that we have our request here, get /fact to catfacts.ninja, and here is our response, 200 OK, and here is the fact that is returned at the end. Now, something that's really useful in Burp Suite that we'll be using a lot throughout the course is called the repeater. So you can press Ctrl+R, or you can right-click and send to repeater to send a request to the repeater tab. Now here, what we have is we have the request, but we don't have any response. And if we come back here, we can't actually modify this request at all. We can't do anything with it. We can see what we sent and what we got back. But with the repeater, we can modify things. So for example, I can remove the cookie and then send the request again. And you can see that it tries to set a new cookie. But obviously, in this way, we can start to interact with the application in a manual way to test API endpoints. And for example, here we have fact and we have the max length is 100. What happens if we pass -1? Will this break the application? Will this have some strange behavior? It seems like it handles it gracefully and just returns nothing, but this is a good way to start testing API endpoints. So the next way we're going to look at interacting with our API endpoints is by using Postman. So I'll go through the interface and kind of an introduction to Postman in the later section because there's quite a lot to look at, but all we're going to do this time is grab this endpoint from here and put it into a GET request. So we can just copy and paste this in, select GET from here if it's set to something else, hit send, and you can see that we get some information back. So the average cat can jump 8 feet in a single bound. So that's pretty impressive. And here, of course, same as Web Suite, we can inspect things like the cookies, the headers, and we can also modify the request as well. So we can come back and put in our max length and the value, let's say 30, send this back, and we get another cat fact. So this gives us a lot more control over than just using the browser. Obviously, Postman and Burp Suite both have pros and cons to them, and we'll be exploring both throughout this course because I think you should always use the right tool for the right situation. And sometimes it's hard to make that call, but if we know how to use both, then we're going to be much better equipped to dealing with any APIs that come our way. So the final thing I want to share with you is curl. So I'm just going to come over to my terminal and open a new tab. And it's always useful to be able to use the terminal if you need to quickly test something or write a short script. Sometimes we need to be able to do something that doesn't come standard in the tools we use. So instead of messing around with extensions, we could just use tools like bash and curl and get the job done. So here, I'm just going to curl https://catfact.ninja, and core/fact. And you can see that as before, it comes back with a response. And if we want to see more information like the headers, we can use verbose mode. So we can just send the same request with -v and send it again, and we get all the information we need, and we can pass that to another command line tool or save the outputs or do whatever we want with it. And that's it for this video. Next up, we're going to look at different types of APIs and then a brief introduction to API security before we go into setting up our lab in the next section. I'll see you there. In this section, we'll run through a little bit of terminology and types of APIs. So far, we've been using the generic term API, but there are different ways of implementing them. Let's start with REST APIs. These are also known as RESTful APIs. REST stands for Representational State Transfer, and of course it's an API all the same, except there are some constraints and rules you need to abide by when designing and building them. Some examples of these constraints for RESTful APIs are they must use a server-client architecture, so the server and clients are separate entities. They must also use HTTP methods, such as get, post, put, and delete to manipulate data. And finally, they must be stateless, so each individual request can be understood by the server. There's a little bit more to RESTful APIs than that, but this gives us enough to start with. Just try to remember that API is more of an architectural pattern rather than a standard. Next up, we have public, partner, and private APIs, and these are a little bit more straightforward. A public API is simply an API that anyone can use and interact with, like the previous CAT API that we looked at. Other popular examples might include Twitter or the Google Maps API. Partner APIs might be shared between a number of companies. For example, a central bank might publish data for other banks to access via an API. And finally, we have private APIs, which are generally used within a single organization. Maybe you work for a tech company that publishes lots of applications, so you might want to consider one set of APIs to handle authentication and authorization of customers across all of those applications. Next is the term endpoints, and I've used this a bunch of times already. This term gets thrown around a lot, and you'll hear it probably in every video in this course. When you're scoping pen tests, you might hear things like, there are about 20 endpoints, or all the endpoints are rate limited. So an endpoint is a specific URL, Uniform Resource Locator, that represents a resource or service that can be accessed by making requests to that API. For example, going back to our cat API, /facts is an endpoint that returns a list of all of the cat facts known to humanity. Well, maybe not all of them. We could also make calls to the /breeds endpoint, which would then return a list of known breeds. These are both API endpoints. Next up, we have methods that are often documented with an individual endpoint. So some of the basic ones are get method, which retrieves a resource, a post method, which creates a resource, put, which updates or creates within an existing resource, patch, which partially modifies an existing resource, and delete that removes a resource. So that's it for terminology. Next up, we have an overview of API security, so I'll catch you there. Realistically speaking, APIs can be subject to many common web attacks, such as injection, IDOR, and broken access control. Now, don't worry if you don't know what these attacks are yet, we will cover them in the coming modules. But something to remember here is that even though APIs tend to be more flexible and scalable, they are not inherently more secure than any other method of web development. It all comes down to how you design and build your APIs, along with the security controls around them. If you look into API development and usage over the last few years, you'll see that it has increased dramatically. Unsurprisingly, this comes with more attacks on API endpoints. Coupled with rapid development and that an API might be updated weekly or even daily, the potential for security issues to arise is high. Another somewhat common issue is that of legacy or zombie APIs. Deprecated APIs can be left unchecked for long periods of time, and they are a perfect target for an attacker, especially if they're not actively being monitored. So, as penetration testers, security researchers, security engineers, or developers, we need to be able to effectively interact with, understand, and test our APIs against all sorts of attacks. And that's it for this short introduction. The rest of the course is going to be fully hands-on, and we're going to set up our lab and jump straight into how to attack and exploit API endpoints. I'll see you there. All right, let's set up our lab. What we're going to do is we're going to run through some of the common tools that we need, how to set them up and configure them, and then we're going to have a look at some of the basic functionality of those tools so that we're ready to dive in the next section. So let me just bring you over to the VM. Now, first things first, if you don't have Kali Linux installed, you need to go ahead and download either VMware or VirtualBox and install it. And if you're not sure how to do this, then there's a great video on the Cybermentor YouTube channel, which is Linux for Ethical Hackers 2022, full Kali Linux course. And if you go to the timestamp 253, which I think is the second section, this guides you through how to install Kali Linux virtual machine on either VMware or VirtualBox, whichever you prefer. Now that said, you don't actually have to use Kali Linux for this course. You can use whatever distribution you want, whether it's Windows, Linux, macOS, but as long as you have the tools like Postman and Burp Suite, and you're able to route traffic from your browser with something like Foxy Proxy, which you can easily add to your Firefox, you should be good to go. So use whatever platform you want, but Kali makes it easy to get up and running and has most things ready to go. So I'm just going to close this, and what we're going to do first is install Postman. So I'm just going to go to Firefox. We're going to come to Google, and then I'm just going to search for Postman download. And the postman.com and the downloads page is what we want. So I just come down to here, Linux x64, and then I just save this file. And it'll take a minute or so to download, depending on your internet speed. Now that that's downloaded, I'm just going to come up to the menu and come to a terminal, and then cd into downloads. And you can see we have our Postman file. So to unzip this, we just do tar xvf xvzf. I always forget the command to unzip. Yeah, tar xvzf. And that's going to unzip this. And you can see that we have Postman. Now, this isn't the ideal location for it, but we're going to quickly test that it's all working okay. So we just cd into the folder and then /postman. Hit enter. And if it runs and you get this GUI window, then you know you're good to go. Now, feel free to sign up a free account for Postman if you want to, or you can come in and just skip and go straight into the application. And we should be good to go. I'm going to close this. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move this to my ops folder because I don't want Postman residing in my downloads folder. So I'm going to come back up to downloads, and we need sudo to move to opt. So I'm just going to sudo move, Postman to /opt. Type in the password, which by default, if it's a new installation, is Kali. And then if we cd into opt, you can see that it's here. And there is one other thing that I want to do as well. So to run Postman, I now need to go opt postman, which is kind of a lot of effort. Let me just close this again. So I'm going to add a link. And to do this, all we need to do is sudo ln and -s. And then I'm going to go opt postman, and then I'm going to place this link in user bin postman. And now when I type postman, it's going to run Postman, which makes life a little bit easier for us. So good to keep our virtual machine in nice, smooth working order. Now, if you're having trouble with Postman, obviously it's a pretty popular tool, so a little bit of Googling goes a long way. But if you're really stuck, drop into the Discord and we'll be happy to help you out. So next up, we need Foxy Proxy. So I'm just going to come back to Google and come and search for Foxy Proxy. And we have Foxy Proxy Standard. Add to Firefox, click Add, and you can see it comes up here. And what we want to do is we want to come in here, click Options, click Add, and then I'm just going to call this 8080 because this is the ports that I'll be routing traffic on, but you can call it anything like, Burp Suite or Cheesecake or whatever you want, really. And then feel free to set a color. So I'm just going to set this to blue. And then we want HTTP proxy 127.0.0.1.8080 and click Save. And now you can see when we click on Foxy Proxy, if we click on 8080 here, we're going to be routing our traffic through 8080, although this isn't going to work because our proxy isn't running currently. We'll get a proxy servers refusing connections, but you can easily switch it on and off. So let's open up Burp Suite. So you should have Burp Suite already ready to go. We just click Next, Start Burp Suite. Click OK. And what we want to do is switch on our proxy. And we want to come to, http://burp. And you'll see we have a CA certificate here. So we need to go ahead and download this certificate. So just save this. This is so Burp Suite can intercept HTTPS traffic. And then we come to Settings, think Privacy and Security. We'll scroll down to Certificates, click View Certificates, and then click Imports and double click the downloaded certificate. Now, I think I already did this, so I already have this certificate installed as a certificate authority, but yours, what it'll do is it'll pop up and it'll say, hey, do you want to trust this certificate to identify websites and or emails? You can just check the websites one and then click OK, and you should get a message saying successfully imported. So now with our proxy, switched on, we can browse to things like Google or any other website that uses HTTPS traffic. Now, if yours is hanging like mine is, it's probably because you have intercept switched on. So you can just come in proxy intercept, switch that off, and then everything should work okay. Note that even when intercept is off, the traffic is still flowing through the proxy. It's just you need to come to HTTP history to see it, and it's not going to hold it for review or modification before sending it on, if that makes sense. One other thing to note is that if you prefer, you can come to proxy intercept and open browser, and this will open a Chromium browser, and the traffic will also go to Verb Suite. So if I go to YouTube, for example, and then I come back to HTTP history, you can see that this traffic is being caught in the proxy. So it's up to you which you use. I like to use both because basically Firefox lets me switch the proxy on and off, which is quite handy. Also worth noting that browsers have slightly different behavior, especially with things with like same site lax being default on Chrome. So when you're testing websites, you might want to test across different browsers. If you're doing A/B testing with like user A and user B, comparing their privileges or looking at how they interact together, having one running in Firefox, which is routing traffic through your proxy, and one running in Chrome is really, really handy to have as well. So make use of them how you see fit. And throughout the course, you'll see me doing this from time to time, and hopefully you can pick up on some tips to make your workflow methodology a little bit smoother. All right, so let's get started with Burp Suite, one of my favorite tools. Now, you'll notice throughout the course that I'll be using the Professional Edition, but don't worry, if you're only on the Community Edition and things like Intruder, etc. are throttled, or you don't have the engagement tools for creating payloads, I'll also be showing you how to use open source tools to achieve the same thing. So you don't need the Professional Edition, but I wanted to include it in the course because a lot of you who take the course might go on to becoming a security engineer or penetration tester, and you'll need to be able to use it when you're in those roles. And some of you may already be working penetration testers, for example, and may already be on the Professional Edition. So we're going to use both in the course. So don't worry if you have it. Use it, great. If you don't have it, don't worry about it. I'll show you other ways to solve things later on. All right, so first up, we have the dashboard, and immediately what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to the target, and we're going to take a look at the scope, because when I browse the internet, we get a lot of extra traffic. So if I go to Google, for example, I've got Google open, and we've got this vuln web open as well, which I'm just going to use for capturing traffic and showing you Burp Suite. Let me switch on Burp Suite quickly. You'll see that, let's say we load this page, but we're also looking at, I don't know, cat pictures with a missing C. So I put app pictures. You'll notice that our proxy suddenly is flooded with traffic from a lot of places. So the easiest way to set up the scoping is to right click on something that you've browsed to and simply click Add to Scope. And when we come over to the target scope, you can see that we have this enabled. Now, if you added something that was like, if you added something that was like accounts, email or something like this then isn't going to find everything underneath that. So try and make sure that you just have the effective top level domain, and then you should be good to go. And this means that when I clear this and I come to Google, because I'm using the browser for multiple things, we don't get any Google traffic. But when I refresh my vulnweb.com page, we do get the vulnweb stuff. Now, something that I would also recommend is coming in here and enable CSS images and other binary. I like to see everything in my HTTP history. This is a personal preference, but you can choose whether you want to see that or not. So that's scope out of the way. And next thing I want to do is, I'm just going to move myself out of the way for a second, is look at the requests themselves. So we come down to here. I'm just going to close the inspector. You can see that this is the request that we sent to the web service. So we went to test.php testphp.vulnweb.com/search and the test query. And this was the response we got. And you'll notice that we can't edit here. We can't change this, unfortunately. But if we press Ctrl R, you'll see that repeater flashes up. Or if we right click and send to repeater, it sends this request to the repeater. And the repeater is exactly as it says. So what we can do is we can change the query, whoops, and send it again, and then we can look at the response. And in this case, we actually got a MySQL warning, so connection refused. So let me send it again. This is not the most stable target in the world, probably because it's a purposefully vulnerable website and maybe lots of other people are using it at the same time. But repeater is kind of like the bread and butter of Burp Suite. We're going to be spending a lot of time in here testing payloads, looking at API endpoints, manipulating them, thinking about the responses that come back, how they change, and just some tips. Whenever you send a request like this, what you want to look out for is the status code, so just keep that in mind, and the content length as well. So if I send a payload, I might want to compare, has the page actually changed? Have I induced something? And if the content length is vastly different, so let's say it throws a completely different page with an error message, I might be onto something. And this kind of gives me an indication without having to go down and read through all of the HTML that's on the page. You can also render as well if you prefer. I don't use this that often, just from time to time, but useful to know that it's there. So the collaborator and sequencer are kind of like a little bit more specialist. And what we're going to do is I'm going to leave these out for our demo for now, but we will cover these, in particular the sequencer, because we'll be doing token analysis later on in one of the labs. So just know that they exist, collaborator and sequencer, and we'll get to them later in the course. The decoder is very useful, however. So let's say we come back to repeater and we have a payload that looks something like test equals http / Google, and it's encoded. In fact, we want to. So we've URL encoded all of the characters, and this is what you get. So if I just copy this and I go to the decoder, I can paste this in, and we can do decode as URL, and then again we can decode as URL. So in the first instance, it only encoded the key characters as to not break a HTTP request, and in the second encoding, it encoded every single character. So if you see things that need decoding, this is a great place to do it. Or if you have a payload that you want to encode, for example, let's say I want this as base 64, you can come in here and encode it, and then you can encode it again or decode it, for example, and you can see the plain text and the encoded text. So pretty handy to have this as part of Burp Suite. Of course, there are a lot of websites or terminal commands you can use to encode and decode. Occasionally, you'll see me piping stuff to base 64 in the terminal, just a slightly different workflow, but you can decide what works for you. Comparer is quite handy. We use this from time to time. So if you have two requests, let me come back to proxy, and we right click and send to comparer. You can either send the request or the response to comparer. I'm just going to send the request, and I'm also going to send this one to comparer as well. You can see we have both selected, and you can compare the words or the bytes. I'm just going to go with words for now, and then we can see differences in our requests. Now, if you're attacking something and you think that the response is ever so slightly different, so you see the content length is like 5001 instead of 5000, instead of scrolling through and trying to find out what the exact difference is, you can come to comparer and compare two responses in that case. So this is pretty handy. And the last thing we're going to look at is extensions. So you actually see that I have a couple of extensions installed already. These are just my personal ones that I use from time to time. But if we come to extensions, come into the App Store, Probably at some point throughout the course, we'll be using one or two extensions just to make life a little bit easier. But if you want to search for one, so let's say pentest map is not a bad one. This comes with a checklist and an API mapper and some other things. You can just click on it, come down to install, and you can see that it's now appeared here. So you can make use of this extension. I definitely recommend doing a little bit of research on some of the more popular extensions. They're pretty powerful, make your workflow a little bit easier, but don't get too hung up on them. I'm yet to see an extension that completely blows my mind. Of course, they do save me time and make testing a little bit easier, but you can get by without them as well. So that's it for our whirlwind tour of Burp Suite. Now, don't worry if you got a little bit lost, if it's your first time using Burp Suite. We're going to be using it a lot throughout the course. And of course, I'll be there every step of the way with the videos so that you can follow what I'm doing, understand what's happening, and then absorb all of that information as well. I just wanted to give you a quick overview introduction. So really don't worry if you don't remember any of that. We're going to go through it a lot more in the sections to come. So I'll catch you in the next video for a quick rundown of Postman. Right, let's take a quick look at Postman. So if I bring you over to my VM, and you can see I've already loaded up Postman and I've also signed in as well. So if your front page looks a little bit different, then feel free to create a free account, log yourself in, and that's going to enable workspaces. And workspaces are quite useful. They're basically like projects, and being able to create multiple workspaces for different applications is pretty handy. So I do recommend you sign up a free account and do this. So I'm just going to come in and I'm just going to create a workspace, and I'm just going to call this API test. And then I'm just going to make it personal and then create a workspace. And here we go. One thing I forgot to mention, if you load it up and you're not in dark mode already, if you come into this cog here and go settings and come to themes and you prefer dark mode, then click dark mode. Obviously I have mine set to system default, so it's matching my system settings, but you can change that in here. I know that some people like to work late at night, and the bright version of Postman can be a little blinding. So if workspaces are basically projects, then collections are groups of requests. So we can come in here and we're in our workspace. So we're in the API test workspace, and we can just click new. And what we want to do is a new HTTP request. In fact, actually, let's create a new collection. So let's do new collection. And we'll edit this. I think you can rename with Control E. So I'm just going to call this cats, or you can click on the three dots and yeah, there's rename, duplicate, exports, everything you need in here as well. And in here, what we want to do is add a request. So I'm just going to call this cat breeds, and I already have a URL sitting on my clipboard. So we're going to go to catfacts.ninja/breeds, and I think we don't need any other parameters. We can just send this request and we get the response back. And if we want to create another request, we can just come into our collection and add request. And we'll do the same. So we'll call this one cat facts. And instead of doing the breeds, all we want to do is paste this and change this to fact. And as you can see, we can start to build out our collection. And you might want to create another collection called dogs, for example. And personally, what I tend to do on applications when I'm working with Postman is, if I can't import a collection, which I'll show you how to do in a moment, I will create my collections based on functionality or kind of logical groupings of endpoints. So if we have a forum, I might have endpoints like posting and commenting and editing posts in one collection, and I might have like administration activities such as update user, ban user, change user privileges in a separate collection as well. So that's my kind of personal workflow, but you can group your collections however you want. We'll get more into this later, but of course it's very easy to change the types of requests and then add in a body, make it form data, for example. But for now, this is a very quick intro to Postman. And something that we want to do is be able to import collections. So a lot of applications will have a collection of API endpoints ready to go. And so what we can do is we can choose files. I'm going to come to home and then labs and crappy. So this is one of the applications that we'll be looking at, not exclusively, but it is a pretty good open source API driven web application. And if we come into Postman collections, you can see that we have the collection.json and the Postman environment.json. So we want both of these. And all we're going to do is click open, click import, and you can see that it's nicely separated out. So even though these are different applications, it's pulled them in as a collection. So our import is nice and clean. And then when we click down onto it, you can see all of the endpoints as well. So we can start using this and sending them. Now you'll notice that sometimes variables are used and this says unresolved. If this is the case, when you're working with your environment, you either need to import the environment or you need to come to the top here and you see how it says no environments, just click crappy and then it will autofill this as well. If we come back to no environment, you can manually set these variables as well by coming down and just clicking add new variable, and this will also do the trick. But there are a lot of variables and a lot of scripts used, which makes Postman really, really powerful for testing lots of APIs quickly. And it's good to get started with what the developers provided. So again, that was a very brief introduction to Postman. And don't worry if you're new to Postman and you're like, oh, there's a lot of buttons and a lot of things to do and a lot of things to remember. We're going to go through all of it, and throughout the videos, you'll get more and more comfortable with it. So we're going to kind of learn by doing, if that makes sense. I'll see you in the next video. All right, we have one last thing to set up before we dive into the next section. So what I want you to do is we're going to be utilizing a number of labs for the course. Some of them we've built as demonstrations to help you really understand vulnerabilities without the added complexity of large applications, and some of them open source. So the first thing I want you to do is come to Google. Oops, we'll switch off our proxy. And then we'll search for crappy API, GitHub. And you can see this OWASP/crappy, completely ridiculous API. And I want you to come into here and then click code and then click this copy button. So this is going to click the link to the .git file. Come back to your terminal, and here we're in the home directory. So, whoops, no, we're not. We're in the root directory. Now we're in the home directory. And what I like to do is I don't like to dump loads of stuff in here. So I'm just going to make a directory called labs and cd labs. The rest of the labs that we're going to be using as part of the course, you'll see them as we go, and then you'll be able to pull them in, unzip them, and run them. So the only one we need to get up and running with is the crappy application for today. So git clone and then paste, and we'll give this a minute to download the application. And before we can run this application, what we need to do is we need to install Docker.io and Docker Compose. So let's just clear this, and we'll just do sudo apt install docker.io, and we'll hit yes. You can also give it the -y flag to automatically hit yes, and this will take a minute to install. Now, if you get this error, this is quite easy to solve. So you can see that it gives us a error message saying unable to fetch some archives, maybe run sudo apt-get update or try with fix missing. So we'll sudo apt update fix missing. Give this a minute to run. And now we can sudo apt install docker io. Yes. So here we get there are services installed on your system which need to be restarted. I'm just going to go with yes. I don't mind it restarting services. All right. And the next one we need is sudo apt install docker compose. And we'll go with yes. And which services should be restarted? I'm just going to hit enter to say okay. And then we should be good to go. Now we do get a little pop-up in the top right hand corner saying that, hey, we need to restart. So I'm just going to go ahead and restart my guest. And we can log ourselves back in. Come back to the terminal, cd labs, cd crappy. And for this one, most of the labs, you'll just need to cd into the folder where the application is and sudo docker compose up. You'll see this in the following sections. But for crappy, we need to come into deploy/docker. And then you can see the docker compose files are here. So sudo docker-compose up. And this is going to take a little while to download everything it needs and spin up the application. The first time you do it, it'll take, a little bit of time, but the next time you do it, because it doesn't need to download everything from the internet, it should spin up much, much faster. So within, 20, 30 seconds, maybe. All right, so now it looks like everything is up and running. So we're going to come back into Firefox. And we're going to go to localhost 8888. And we get our login page. So if you don't see this just yet, make sure that everything is up and running. Usually you'll see crappy web requests like health checks and things. Give it a little bit more time. Otherwise, maybe spin it down again and try once more. So this is the main login page for the application that we'll be using throughout the course. And of course, we'll be using other applications as well. And just a heads up, this runs on 8888, so don't forget that. And the other endpoint that you'll need is 8025 as well. So this is the mail server that's connected to the application. So you'll see that once you log in, you'll get an email with some stuff. This is how you actually read the contents of that email. So that's really, really important. And if I close this and I come back to Docker, and if I just hit Control-C, it's going to gracefully stop. We can force stop by hitting Control-C again, but better to let it spin down in its own time. Now, one other thing that I wanted to show you while it's doing that is if I come back into the labs folder, is that if we're running lots of different Docker containers, sometimes your file system can become full with Docker files. And if you have this problem and you want to clean out all of your old containers, I have a script to do that for you. So this is also included in the text notes as part of this section, so you can see it there. But here I'm just going to vim cleanup.sh insert, and here you can see it stops all of the Docker containers, removes them all, and then removes all the volumes, etc., etc. So if I just save this, chmod +x, you might not need this at all, but just in case, like I say, if Docker's filling up your whole file system, then you might want to remove the ones that you're not using anymore and rebuild the ones that you're using going forward. Just know if you've been running other applications with Docker on your file system, this will remove all of them. So you'll still have, for example, the crappy application here, but when you sudo docker compose up, it will rebuild the application, if that makes sense. So here, I'm just going to make sure that this is finished, which it is, and then sudo /cleanup.sh And you can see that it's cleaned up everything. So the MongoDB Postgres data, this was all from the crappy application. And that's it for this section. So you should be all set up and ready to go. And I'll see you in the next video. All right, welcome to this section. So the first thing we should do before we even consider the attacks we might try on a target application is to enumerate. Now, the objective here is to understand what application functionality exists. This includes intended functionality like registering, logging in, updating your profile, and potentially functionality that may have been overlooked, such as a file upload that is there but not ready yet for users to be accessing. We should also be on the lookout for things like special files that might have configuration information or robots.txt and sitemaps that can provide further useful information. In this section, we'll do two things. The first is fuzzing to discover hidden content, and the second is manually reading some JavaScript files to harvest useful information from the application. Let's dive in. So fuzzing is simply sending different data in a number of requests and seeing what comes back. It can be really useful in discovering content or functionality. And in this video, we're going to look at both Burp Suite's Intruder and also wfuzz, but there are actually many different tools you can use. I recommend you try out different ones to see what suits your workflow or methodology. In this demo, I'm going to be using an endpoint from Bookstore, which you can see on screen now. And this is a free room available on TryHackMe. So by all means, go ahead, sign up an account to TryHackMe and come to Bookstore if you want to follow along. So here we have some API documentation, and we can see that we have API/v2/resources and /books. And the author here in this case, or in this example, is J.K. Rowling. And we can also filter by things like the publish date. And what I've done is I've set this up in repeater. So you can see that I'm sending a request to API v2 resources books and the parameter published and the value 1993. And we do indeed get some data back. Now, there are a few points here that I want to think about when I start fuzzing. So the first one is v2. So when I see this, I always think, is there a v1? Is there a v0? Is there a beta? Is there a v3? Is there a v4? So this is probably our first point of call for fuzzing the endpoint. After that, I want to look at the endpoint here. So we're in resources. There might be other endpoints available as well, aside from books, for example, authors. And then after that, we look at the parameters. So what parameters will this endpoint take? Will it take published? Will it take unpublished? Will it take other things? And then finally, after this, we can look at the parameter values. And here we're probably looking for things like injection techniques or special characters to see whether our input is handled in an insecure way. So let's make a start with this. And to begin with, all I'm going to do is change this. I'm going to do this manually because our data set is quite small, and we send v0 and we get 404 not found. Okay, and we get v1 and we get 200 okay, which is interesting because we also got 200 okay on v2. So a couple of things that we want to look at here are the status code, so 200, and we want to see the content length as well. So this is 408. So if I then send the request to v2, we can see that we get the same content length. So I'm pretty sure that this data is the same as the previous one. And in this case, it's quite easy to check. We can just go left and right, and the only thing that changes is the time date stamp or the timestamp here. But if we had a page with a content length of like 10, 20,000, then it would be a little bit harder to check. So next up, we want to take a look at /books. So I'm going to press Ctrl-I to send this to the intruder. And if you don't have Burp Suite Professional, don't worry. We're going to do the exact same thing with wfuzz in just a minute. So we'll do Burp Suite first and then wfuzz afterwards. And we come to intruder. We clear this. We add our payload point here. We come to payloads and then we load. And let's just do a small word list for now. and we'll click Start Attack. And you can see that the content length of the original request is 620, and the other ones look like they're 292. So I'll give this a minute to run. And now it's finished, we can take a look at the results. And it doesn't look like we got anything else. We only have one request with a different length and only one request with the status 200. All of the rest were 404s. Unsuccessful here, but still useful to check. So I'm just going to discard this and then come back, and then let's clear this selection and let's change this published to something else. And let's attack the published field. Probably we can keep the same word list. Looks like it didn't find anything once again, so it looks like there's nothing too exciting to find against this endpoint. But what we're going to do is we're going to try the same thing against the V1 endpoint. And I'm just going to keep the attack the same and just click Start and see what it comes back with. All right, so let's take a look. And we do actually get something that gave us a 500 response instead of 404, or a totally different content length. And this was the parameter show. And we can come in here, take a look at the response, and we get an internal server error. So I suspect, given that we get this name error, file name is not defined, what I think is happening here is that the parameter is then throwing the error. So we're passing this, sorry, the value is throwing the error. So we're passing this value into the parameter show, even though it says published here, and that's causing an issue. So let's discard this, come back to our repeater, change this to 1, change this to show, click send, and we get 500. And let's see what happens if we give it a blank parameter. We get not found. And what we can now do is clear this, do show, hit the parameter value, and then start the attack again. And at this point, we probably want to think about different word lists. So we're doing a kind of a generic word list at the moment that's good at finding directories, but we probably want to consider something that's a little bit more targeted based on the error message that we got. And since it said invalid file name or file not found or something like this, if I recall, we might want to consider a list of common Linux files because the target system is a Linux system. All right, so I'm actually going to close this because it seems like the application is struggling a little bit under our attack, which can happen when you're fuzzing, especially for vulnerable endpoints. And I'm just going to come back here, just do a quick refresh. So it actually seems like we've found a vulnerable endpoint. But we've unfortunately crashed the application, which is a great lesson to learn because this can happen when we're fuzzing. Fuzzing can be quite destructive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here. I'm just going to terminate the machine. And then I'm just going to start it up again. And I'll see you back here in a minute so that we can review what's happened. All right, so I've just restarted the application, brought it back up, loaded in a new list. So I'm using common now in user share word lists deb instead of this small list. And we're going to see how this goes. So I just click start attack. And instantly I actually get some with different lengths. So I'm actually going to pause this quickly to take a look and see what's happening. So our initial request is 500. So we get a response back that says internal server error, and the error file name is not defined, which is the error that we got before. And then we have a request that has a blank payload. So this gives us a 404 not found. And then interestingly, we get a 200 response for bash history. So we come back and we actually see that we have some data here. So it seems like it's reading from the .bash history file. So we have indeed found a vulnerable endpoint and managed to fuzz for local file inclusion vulnerability. So super interesting, and hopefully this gives you a good insight into how useful, but also sometimes how dangerous fuzzing can actually be. So before we do this in wfuzz, let's just take another quick look at the positions. So first we looked at /v1, while this was /v2 before, and we guessed that there might be other versions of the API endpoint available. And then we looked at the books endpoints. We looked for other endpoints that were not listed on the documentation. So if you recall, we only had this documentation, which only gave us a few different endpoints. And then we looked at parameter names, which is where we found the show parameter, which wasn't listed in our documentation. And then we fuzzed the parameter value to discover that this was vulnerable to file inclusion. All right, so let's come over to our terminal and let's try this with wfuzz. So all I'm going to do is type wfuzz, and we're going to add some color and then -z for the type. And the file we're going to use is, I like to add a space here so I can use autocomplete with the tab, and then I'll remove the space afterwards. So user share word lists derb, and I think we used the common. And then I'm just going to come back and remove that. And then what we want to do is grab the target. So in this case, we can take the IP address, http:// and then take the endpoint. Here, and we type fuzz, and I think we need this in quotes as well. So I'm just going to run this to begin with without any filtering. And you'll notice that we get a lot of data back. So what we actually want to do is we want to filter out the 500s. So here we're only looking for the values of the HTTP response codes of 200. So I can just do --sc 200. That didn't work as expected. Maybe it's HC. I can't remember off the top of my head. We might have to add this back here. Okay, so the order matters. So you need to add this, I think, before our target. So the target needs to be the final thing in our list of inputs. And as you can see, this time around, we just get our 3 responses that we want instead of lots of 500 errors. And we found bash rc, profile, and bash history. And I suspect this is also a little bit faster than Burp Suite as well. So this can be a good option for you. Gives you a little bit more control out of what's coming out of the tool rather than being bogged down with a user interface. And it's really up to you which tools you want to use going forward. And that's it for this video. So I hope this was a nice quick introduction to fuzzing, something that is really, really important to learn and understand how to do. But really, you only get better at it by doing it. And throughout the course, you'll have plenty of chances to try fuzzing against different applications that you'll have access to. I'll see you in the next video. All right, finally, before we dive into the next section where we'll be attacking authorization, we're going to just look a little bit at manual enumeration. So whenever I start attacking a new application, I switch on Burp Suite and I try to test all of the functionality that I can find. And this helps me achieve two main things. Firstly, I can review the traffic afterwards so I can understand how the application is working under the hood. And secondly, I can start to understand how the application is meant to behave, which helps when we're trying to find peculiar behavior that might indicate a security vulnerability. Here, we're going to take a quick look at some of the JS files in the crappy application. So I'm just going to log in quickly. I already have an account set up and I'm going to bring up the developer tools, and I'm just going to move myself out of the way so that you can easily see. I'll zoom in a little bit. And we might want to go through, test all of these endpoints, see what comes up in Burp Suite. In fact, I'll just show you quickly. So we'll click through, click on some posts. We'd add some comments. I'm just going to do this very quickly. But you take a little bit of time to come through. Change video name. And then once you've understood all of the functionality in the application, you can come back to Burp Suite and you can see everything is mapped in here. So we can start looking at what are these API endpoints and what kind of data do they return. But really what I wanted to show you, and the main point of this video, is coming to the developer tools, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit, come over to the debugger tab. And what I want to do is have a look through some of the files, and I'm not really trying to understand what's happening here. I'm not going to sit and do code review and dissect the code or dissect the JavaScript that's running in the front end. What I'm just looking for is information. So we can just drop down and we can see that there's a bunch of JavaScript files here, some utilities, location utils. This might have had something like a bunch of locations hard-coded in, but unfortunately not. We'll have a look in source. Just skim through some of these. Doesn't look like exactly what we're after. Let's have a look in static, JS, and this config.js. So we get some top level endpoints, so identity workshop community, so Java microservices, Python microservices, and Go microservices. This is actually really interesting and useful to know. So depending on the endpoint that we're attacking, we will basically need different payloads or potentially different exploits based on the underlying technology. Have a quick look in the index. Have a quick look in here. And this is basically unreadable. So if you have a file like this, what we can do is we can just Control-A, copy, and then come to Google, just search for JS formatter, and you can choose any of these online JavaScript beautifier. Obviously don't do this if there's sensitive information or something like that in your code, or if this is like closed source application, don't go posting it to websites online. But let's just go to the beautify code and we can have a look through. And here, this looks quite interesting. We actually get a bunch of endpoints. So this is really useful information. So we could actually compare this to the Postman file that we got so that we know whether there are any missing endpoints that weren't included for testing. And this might save us a little bit of time fuzzing as well. So this is a really great find, and usually you can find information like this in the front-end JavaScript files. So that was a little bit of a whirlwind tour, and I hoped you picked up some useful tips on how to approach enumerating API-based applications. Your methodology doesn't need to be complicated, but it really does need to be thorough. And I think that a lot of people make mistakes trying to do complex things when actually the simple approach is the best. It's just that the simple approach needs to be done properly. Now, let's start attacking some applications. I'll see you in the next section. So before we dive into the vulnerabilities, we first need to understand what authorization is. Now, often people get mixed up between authorization and authentication. So authentication is who you are, it's your identity, and authorization is what you're allowed to do. I like to think of it as a hotel. When you check in, you show your passport or driving license to prove that the booking is yours, to prove you are who you say you are. Once you've checked in, you get given a room key, and this key gives you access to your room, maybe the lounge or bar, or maybe even the executive suite. This is your authorization. Now, in the OWASP Top 10, there are 2 vulnerabilities related to authorization, so it's really important that we understand how they work and that we can find and exploit them. It takes the number 1 spot with broken object level authorization, also known as BOLA, and it takes the 5th spot, which is broken function level authorization, also known as BAFLA. Now, these might sound a little bit confusing, so let's talk through an example. If we have a web shop and let's say you go to your account page and it says, hey, /webshop and /your user ID. If I change this ID to the ID of another user and I can access their information, this is BOLA, Broken Object Level Authorization. Within the same web shop, if I can carry out functions such as ordering on another user's behalf or accessing administrative functionality, this is BAFLA, Broken Function Level Authorization. So try to think of BOLA as access to objects referenced by their ID, such as a user ID or a GUID or something like this, and try to think of BAFLA as access to functionality that you shouldn't have access to. In the next video, we're going to walk through an example, and then I'm going to give you some challenges to work on. So I'll see you there. So in this video, we're going to walk through a BOLA vulnerability together. Now, this one is slightly less obvious than finding an object ID and just changing it, so going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 and seeing what we find. But it actually highlights the importance of keeping track of the information we find during a pen test and keeping track of what endpoints return what information and how we can use that in our attacks. So feel free to follow along step by step, or you can watch the video all the way through and try and replicate the attack. Afterwards, I'll give you a BOLA challenge to do yourselves, so you can get some real hands-on experience. Let's dive straight in. So here I have Burp Suite open, and I have the crappy API open, and I also have Mailhog open running on 8025. So I'm just going to sign up a new account. So I'm just going to call this Alex, and I already have an account a@tcmsec.com, so I'm just going to put b@tcmsec.com, and then I'm just going to give it a random string for a random number for the phone number. Password 1 exclamation mark, password 1 exclamation mark. So very easy credentials. We're registered, and then b@tcmsec.com, password 1. And then we click log in. So we have no vehicles found. So if we come to Mailhog and check the mail, we have the VIN and the PIN code. So I'm just going to copy and paste this, add vehicle, paste, copy and paste the PIN code in here, and verify vehicle details, and we get a success. Awesome. And we get a Lamborghini. Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted. That's my kind of car. And the vulnerability here is down in the refresh location. So what I'm going to do is we're going to take a look at this request. So I'm going to come to Foxy Proxy, switch on Burp Suite, which is listening on 8080, and hit refresh location. And then I'm going to come over to Burp Suite, come to my HTTP history. I'm just going to remove this Google request. And here we are. So let's take a closer look at this, and I'm just going to move my face out of the way. Here we have the get identity API v2 vehicle, and we have a vehicle ID. So this looks like a GUID, very long, probably difficult to guess, but nonetheless we should make note of this because it's referencing the object directly. And then we have /location. And in here, it returns some sensitive data. Now, if it didn't really return anything interesting, then maybe we wouldn't look so closely at this endpoint. But because we can see the latitude, longitude, and the name of the person it's assigned to, I would say this warrants some investigation. So we're going to send this to repeater for later on. And actually, we're just going to do a quick test. So we're just going to cut this, and I'm just going to put in 123, 123. And we get a 400, so nothing interesting from there. And you can try a few different payloads like 0, -1, and some different things to try and trick the application. With code review, that might be a little bit easier to figure out if there is a payload that will trick this. But we don't get any successful results without a valid ID. So if we come back to our application, we now need to think, where can we find a ID within this application? And it just so happens that when we come to the community page and we come to /forum, this triggers a call to the endpoint community posts /recent. And as we're going through and checking all of the API endpoints, this one is of particular interest because actually it gives us quite a lot of information. This is definitely excessive data exposure. So we've got email addresses, we've got nicknames, and as we look on the page, we're only actually using the username and the post like excerpt or some text. We don't need things like the email address and things like that of the users. So this API endpoint, is sending back way too much data. And so this is a finding in itself. And we'll talk about excessive data exposure later on. But here, it gives us the vehicle ID. So our hunt, although it was very short, has been successful. And we can verify this by taking this ID, coming back over to the repeater, and pasting it in here. Now, in a correct implementation, when we send this request, it's going to come back and say, hey, you're not authorized. You're not allowed to see the location of cars that don't belong to you. But because we have the broken object level authorization vulnerability here, as long as I have the vehicle ID or the object ID, I can make this request and I can see the information of this car. So that's the first vulnerability that we have that we've walked through together. And I hope that made sense. Every time you see a URL and you see a object ID being referenced, or if you see it being passed within the body of a request, we should look at, we should consider, is this a Bowler vulnerability? Is this a vulnerability here? So for your challenge, I'd like you to come back to the dashboard and take a look at the contact mechanic. So if we just click dashboard, contact mechanic, with this, send some requests, inspect them, and see if you can identify the Bowler vulnerability. Try and spend at least 30 minutes on this. If you're really stuck, don't worry, we'll work through it together at the end of the module. Good luck. So, in a nutshell, broken function level authorization, baffler, is all about performing actions that you shouldn't be allowed to perform. For example, if you're not a moderator within a web application, you shouldn't be allowed to delete another user's posts if it's like a forum. Another example could be that you shouldn't be allowed to update the password of another user account. You should only be able to update your own password. So when we approach testing for baffler vulnerabilities, there are a few common techniques that we need to try out. We can test different HTTP methods, for example, changing a GET request to a PUT request. We can also manipulate the parameters within the request so that the action we're trying to perform is attempted on a different object or within a different context. So every time we come across functionality where something can be added, changed, or deleted, we should be checking for baffler vulnerabilities. So let's dive into a hands-on example. Now, I'm going to use Vappy for this, And this is because I want to give you a small challenge within the Crappy application to find a Baffler vulnerability. A quick side note about the challenges before we dive in. For these smaller ones, it's up to you how long you spend on them, or even if you complete them at all. But keep in mind that you'll be developing knowledge and skills that you need for the mid-course capstone and the final capstone challenges, and also for future penetration tests and your future career. So my advice is take them seriously, give them a good try, and if you get stuck, don't worry, we'll go through it together later on. So here we're going to find and exploit some hidden admin functionality. Now, you might think to yourself as we're going through this, but how would I find this? Or, this is kind of a tricky example. Well, if we go back to our enumeration section and we think about how we map endpoints, how we do directory busting, how we do enumeration and discovery, coupled with potentially source code review and having a look at documentation if it's available, you should be able to find endpoints that maybe have been forgotten about or maybe just don't exist in the public documentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come to imports and I'm just going to come to upload files, and then I'm going to come home, dev, vapi, postman. And so wherever you put your vapi installation, if you want to follow along, you're welcome to do this. And you want to import these two files, so vapi postman collection and vapi env postman environment. So I'll just open these, click import, and you'll see that it's created our collection here. And we're going to look at API number 5. So we have create user and get user. Now, if I come to the vapi documentation, and I come to create user, we can see the documentation for this along with an example. So username, password, name, address, mobile number, and we should get a 200 back. And then when we get user, we should be able to post the user ID, as you can see here, and we should get a 200 back with the user information. So let's test this out. So let's come to create user. And looks like this is all set up and ready to go. If it doesn't like this variable, you can right click and set it to localhost. But in this case, it's already set up and ready to go. And we click send. And we wanted to create test user 2. And we have test user and ABC and the mobile number, and the ID is number 3. So now if we come to get user and we test this, and it's going to pass in the current, it's automatically going to pass in the ID 3. So everything's nicely set up for us for testing. Of course, we could manually change this. And we get a successful response, and we have our test user 2, test user ABC 88888. So if I wanted to get a different user, for example, user 1, when I click send, I get false, username or password incorrect. So there is correct authorization put in place here to stop me accessing other users. Now, if I could access the other users, for example, ID number 1, this would probably be broken object level authorization. But what we're going to do is we're going to list all of the users and click send. And here we get a nice flag. If I move myself out the way. And you can see that we've listed all of the users within the application. So the couple that we've created and ID number 1, which is the admin user as well. So being able to grab all of the users is administrative functionality, and therefore we shouldn't be able to do or carry out this function, and this counts as broken function level authorization, also known as Baffler. All right, for the Baffler challenge, I wanted to point you in the right direction. So if we check out Postman here, we see we have some video functionality under the crappy Postman collection. So if we just scroll down, we can see that we have add new video, delete video by admin, re-add new video, etc., etc. Now, there is a short video test file that you can use that comes with Crappy. So if you just come into Crappy and cd into Postman collections, you'll see that you can use this car.mp4, so you don't need to go away and source your own video for this testing. So the challenge is try to add a video, then remove it, make sure the functionality works, and then do some testing across different users. So the challenge here is to see if you can remove the video of another user, so abusing that authorization that should be in place. Now, it's up to you if you use Burp Suite or Postman or any other tool. Personally, for most of my testing, I use Burp Suite. But as we've seen, different tools can help you out in different situations, and you might find that you settle more into Postman and it might work better with your workflow. So try them both, see what works for you, and keep an open mind when it comes to trying out new things. Once you've completed the challenge, I'll see you back here for the walkthrough. So, how did you get on with the challenges? If you solved them both, then congratulations, great job. If you didn't quite manage to find the solutions, then not to worry, we're going to walk through them together now. And the trick to being successful is to keep moving forward, learning new things, and apply what you learned next time. First, let's dive into the Ebola vulnerability. So here, I've just logged in as a normal user and I've added the vehicle, and I think I pointed you guys in the direction of contact mechanics. So this is the endpoint that we're going to look at. So first of all, I'm just going to make sure my proxy is switched on, and then I'm going to hit contact mechanic, and I'm just going to choose one randomly and put in some test data. Now, I always put something in that I can easily recognize, so that in the requests I can see exactly what's happening, but you can put anything in here that you want. So I just click send service request and we get this pop-up back, and we click OK and it brings us back to the main page. So let's switch over to Burp Suite and take a look, and I'm just going to clear out the Google API calls just to make our UI a little bit easier to see. And what I want to look at is this. So this request looks interesting, to say the least. And I'm just going to move myself out of the way. There we go. And what we can see here is when we make the request, we have the mechanic API, and this goes to HTTP localhost 8888 workshop API mechanic receive reports. Now, whenever I see this, I always think, maybe server-side request forgery. But we're going to do a module on that later on, so we'll test out that vulnerability then. Next up, I'm looking at the response, and what I can see is I can see a report link. Now, this wasn't reflected back to us in the UI, but it does indeed seem to exist. So I'm just going to copy this, and then I'm just going to paste this in here, and we can see this goes to API mechanic reports, and it passes an ID which is equal to 6. And we can see the request, so we can see my information that I signed up with, so my email, my number, the problem data that I put in, and obviously, interestingly, we can see that we're passing an ID. So let's test this for Ebola. Let's just change this to 5. Haha, success! And that's it. We managed to exploit this vulnerability. We can actually see Adam007 at example.com, and we can maybe see other reports as well. Looks like test at example.com. So this is broken object level authorization, and this API endpoint is kind of hidden. You don't really see it. At least I didn't see it in the user interface. So we had to inspect the traffic with Burp Suite, find out what's going on, and then check the request and response. So that's the Ebola challenge complete. Now, we discovered a hidden endpoint and our Ebola tests were successful. If this was a live application, that would be a really great finding. Next up, we have the Baffler challenge. So let's do this one in Postman. I have my user here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload a video to the dashboard. So I'm just going to quickly come into Burp Suite, clear history, and then and it instantly refills, and then come back. And I'm going to come to, if we hover over these three dots, if I move my face out of the way, if we hover over these three dots, we see this upload video functionality, which can be a little tricky to click on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into my crappy installation, come to Postman collections, and upload car.mp4, and we get a successful video upload, which is what we want. So now what we're going to do is we're going to come over to Burp Suite. We're going to have a quick look at this, and we're just going to have a look at the ID. So this is ID 36. So we want to note this down for later, because this is the video we're going to try and delete. So if we come over to Postman, I'm just going to sign up a new account. So hit sign up. We're successfully registered. Hit login. And then we can verify our token just for completeness. And we're good to go. So if I come down here, what I'm going to do is I'm also going to upload a video for this new user to test. So if I just come to add video and hit send, we get a 400 bad request, and I presume it's because this video file doesn't like this for some reason. So what I'm going to do is just remove this, click select files, home, dev, whoops, not fappy, crappy, Postman collections, car.mp4, and then we hit send. And it works. So sometimes when we're working with collections, or if we're working with information that we get from an engineering team, things aren't always going to work. Some things are going to be broken. You'll sometimes get misinformation. Maybe you won't get as many accounts as you asked for, all sorts of things. And, that's just part of being a security engineer or working in tech in general, is that, we have to be able to deal with misinformation or things, sometimes troubleshoots and stuff. So we got our video, we got our 200 OK, and our video is successfully uploaded. And to test this, let's just do the get video. So this is ID 38. And then if we just hover over, we can see the current is ID 38. Hit send, and we do indeed get our video back. Now, what I want to do is I want to test this delete video. So we're just going to test it on ourselves first. So I just hit send. And it kind of gives us a bit of a hint here, although some functionality or API endpoints will give us information as you're testing, but try to access the admin API is, if I move myself out of the way, is quite a big hint for this challenge. So I'm going to come over to delete video by admin. I'm going to click send. And we get an interesting error here. So, invalid token. Interesting that it doesn't say that we don't have privileges to do it. It actually says our token is invalid. So I suspect there's something slightly off, again, with this request or this setup. So what I'm going to do is, instead of troubleshooting this and trying to fix it, I'm just going to pay attention to the URI. And it says here, API/v2/admin/videos. And this looks very similar to API/v2/user/videos. So I know that this endpoint works correctly. So I'm just going to type in /admin and hit send. And it says our video is deleted successfully. Now we need to verify this. So we have video 38. If we come back to get video, we're still requesting video 38. We get video not found. Awesome. So we can delete our own video. So let's come back here and we'll double check the ID. So 36 is the one that appeared in Burp Suite. So we'll come back and then we'll do our delete video. So I'm just going to type in 36 and then we're going to hit send. And it says, again, user video deleted successfully. Status 200. Huzzah, we have broken function level authorization. And we should double check this. We should make sure that this actually happened on the user profile. So we come here, We hit refresh, and interestingly, it looks like the video is still there. So what we're actually going to do is, front-end frameworks can be quite complicated. There's a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes, especially with caching and all sorts of things that might be keeping stuff alive. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to log out. I'm going to log back in. Come back to the profile, and we can see we have indeed deleted the video. So here we can delete videos of ourselves and of other users. So we have broken function level authorization baffler. So that's it for this module. You've made tremendous progress so far, and I hope you can keep it up until the end of the course and into your continued study beyond. Now that you have the fundamentals down for these vulnerabilities, you should be looking always to expand your knowledge and build on these foundations. A good way to do this is by reading write-ups of real-world attacks and findings. And a good place to start is with Sam Curry's blog. You can access it at samcurry.net. It has a bunch of great write-ups and features vulnerabilities that we've covered so far. I hope you enjoyed this module, and I'll see you in the next one. All right, welcome to the next section. Now, we're going to talk about authentication. So, what is authentication? Well, it's really all about who you are and proving your identity. So, when you check into a hotel, you provide your ID. That might be a driving license or passport or some other form of identification. And this is authentication. So in web applications, particularly with APIs, there are a few different methods of authentication that we need to know about. So the first one is HTTP basic authentication. We also need to know about bearer tokens, so JSON Web Tokens, OAuth 2.0, and API keys. Now, basic authentication is not used quite as much as it used to be, and there's a good reason for this. The credentials are simply encoded and passed with every request, and this is not a good way to protect credentials, sending them with every request that we make. But they are very easy to implement and use. Now, bearer tokens, which are sometimes referred to as token authentication, are very popular when working with APIs. They're typically passed in the authorization header, but contain the requester's identity. One weakness of this approach, though, is that an application implicitly trusts that the token is owned by the supplier of the token. So when I make a request to an application with a token, the application assumes that that token belongs to me. It doesn't really have a way of checking that I've stolen it or generated it in some way. If we manage to steal or guess another user's token, then the application would be none the wiser. JWTs, JSON Web Tokens, OAuth 2.0, and API keys are all examples of bearer tokens. Over the next few sections, we'll look at how we can attack authentication mechanisms and the tokens themselves. Now, if you feel a little bit overwhelmed at this point about the different authentication schemes and types of tokens, then don't worry. We're going to go through and take a closer look at all of them in action and build a foundation that you can expand on going forwards. See you in the next video. So there are a number of common ways to attack authentication which apply to APIs. We'll take a quick look at these as a refresher, but then dive into how we can attack tokens more specifically in the next video. So usually we can break authentication in two ways. Firstly, the target is unprotected against brute force attacks. Now, a finding I get all the time when assessing API endpoints is a lack of rate limiting or brute force protection, which is a little bit odd because these things are quite trivial to implement, but often forgotten about. Secondly, there is a logic issue with the authentication mechanism. Now, it's also worth noting that we may be able to bypass or break authentication with things like injection attacks. However, because the root cause of the issue in this case is injection, we tend to classify it as that rather than something like broken authentication. In these types of scenarios, it's best to try and identify the root cause and use your best judgment. Now, if you're already familiar with brute force attacks, then feel free to give this lab a go first on your own. Just another thing to note, I'll be showing you two ways to pull off this attack. One with Burp Suite Professional and the other using the fuzzer FUF or FFUF. This is because not everyone has access to the professional edition of Burp Suite. The community edition is rate limited, which obviously for brute forcing makes things a little bit tricky. But if you're just beginning your journey into penetration testing, it's likely that you'll be ending up using the professional edition at some point in the future. So it'll be good for you to see how it works, even if you can't use it right now. Both techniques yield good results, so don't stress if you're strictly sticking to open source tools for the time being. Let's run through this attack together. So here I have the API brute force demo.zip in this folder. So I'm just going to simply unzip this and hit enter, and you can see it's created the folder API brute force demo. So I'm going to cd into this, clear my screen, and then I'm just going to sudo docker compose and build. And then I'll just type in my password, and I'll give it a minute to build the application. This shouldn't take long, it's not too heavy. All right, so that's built, and then we can just do the same, but instead of build, we can do up, like this. And it should be running on port 9000. So if I just fire up Firefox, and I come to, let's maximize this, localhost, and 9000, we should see a brute force me page with a login button. So I'm also going to load up Burp Suite. So notice the professional edition, but you can use the community edition as well. Just know that you're rate limited, and we'll do Burp Suite first and then FFUF or FUF afterwards. All right, so what I want to do is first just test. So I'm just going to log in as admin and click login. And we get invalid password. So interesting that we get a response. It seems like it's confirmed our username. So we can confirm this by just changing the username to something that is very unlikely to exist. And we get invalid username. So we do indeed know that admin is the username. And of course, the password is not admin, but that's what we sent. So I'm just going to close this for now and then switch over to Burp Suite and come to our proxy in HTTP history. And I forgot to turn my proxy on, so I'm going to come back, switch on my proxy, send another request of admin, and then come back and have a look at this request in here. So we can see that it's saying email address and password, although this is actually a username, so just a little bit of a coding error in terms of naming conventions. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to press Control-I, or you can right-click and send to intruder. And in this case, we already know the username is admin, so I'm just going to clear these not sure what this symbol's called, but clear the highlights. And then I'm going to come back in and then highlight the password field, because this is the field that we want to replace. If we wanted to replace the user agent, for example, we would highlight the user agent and then we would click this. And then now that field is marked for our attack, but we don't want to clear the user agent in this case. I'll go over some more advanced brute force attacks later on, but for now, we're just going to be using the sniper. Now, payloads wise, what I'm going to do is I'm going to load in a word list, and I'm just going to click load, and then you can see I've been on TryHackMe recently, I've been live streaming, and I think it will be in user share. Whoops, not source. Share. Cyclists. And I'm just going to go passwords. And then I want a list that's not too long. So even though we're attacking something locally, let's choose something with about 10,000 in it. So the Zato net top 10 million, and then we'll open this. Now, if you don't have cyclists already installed, you can just open the terminal, sudo apt install cyclists, and then you should be good to go. Obviously, I've already got it installed, but if you don't have it, you can just run that command, and then you should be all good from this point. And then all I'm going to do next is I'm going to hit start attack. And then I'm going to give it a minute to run through. Now, because again, we're attacking something on localhost, that was very quick. If it was a live web service, could be much slower, could even take hours to get 10,000 requests. Now, first thing I'm going to check for is the status code. And if I filter by this, we can see that we do indeed have a 200 response here. Something else to check is also the length. So sometimes when you log in, you might always get a 200 response, but the length of the response might be different. So sometimes there'll be subtle differences between the different headers or what's returned. So in here, it's saying Ramirez. So I'm just going to copy this, verify it by coming back to the application and hitting paste. And then we get, hey, success. Here's your flag, TCM, and a flag as well. So if you're answering the questions later on, you'll need this flag. So let's do the same with FUF. So I'm just going to come back to here. And actually, we're going to start off in the same way in that I'm going to come to burp suites. Oops, I'm just going to close this attack. And then proxy, HTTP history. And I'm actually going to just take this request. So I'm just going to hit Control A to select all, Control C to copy. And then I'm just going to come into cd temp. And then I'm just going to vim rec.txt. You can use Nano or Mousepad or whatever editor you prefer. So I like Vim, and I'm going to come in and change this to fuzz because we want to fuzz the password field. So I'm just going to save that. And like I say, if you want something a little bit easier to get up and running with, Mousepad is a good starting one. It's basically like Notepad, but for Kali or Linux. So next, I'm just going to type ffuf, and I'm going to pass the request flag to rec.txt. You can call this request or my file or anything you want. And then I'm going to pass the word list as user share word lists, sec lists, passwords, and then the same one as before, so Zato top 10,000. And then I'm going to put the MC as 200. I think we also need to pass the protocol type as well, which I'm going to put just here. So I don't think the order matters too much, but request proto HTTP. Now, from our earlier attack, I know we're actually looking for a 200. So let's take this off for a second and see what comes back. So I'm just going to cancel this quickly. And you can see we're getting a lot of 401s. So all of these are failed requests. And if we want to check for a 200, we can just put MC 200, and it's only going to show us the 200 responses. Whoops. And you can see very quickly that it found the password. And actually, that was a lot quicker than Burp Suite. So this tool obviously is very, very fast. So from that perspective, it might even be a better tool to use than Burp Suite Pro, for example. And it does have the ability, if you change the mode, so you can, for example, put mode, and you can do, I think it's cluster bomb. I wrote most instead of mode. And this will mimic similar functionality to here, where when we have cluster bomb, we will have two inputs, and it will brute force both of them. So it will be like admin, password 1, password 2, password 3, admin 1, password 1, password 2, password 3, admin 2, password 1, password 2, password 3, for example. So it will go over all the iterations of those if you don't know either. Now, I tend to, in most cases, brute force one field at a time. That tends to work for me, but you know, you can try different things and see what happens with your workflow. So this is a relatively simple scenario, and it's likely that you're going to be faced with challenges that will slow you down, such as rate limiting, such as tokens that you might need to pull out of the page and pass with requests. Cross-site request forgery tokens, for example, you might need to include in your request. So I encourage you to learn a little bit more about brute force attacks generally, as these techniques will transfer nicely to your API penetration testing skills. Now, I have a little challenge for you. It's in the same lab. Now, there is another user that exists within this application, And so my challenge to you is to find out their username and then find out their password and retrieve the flag, similar to as we did for the admin account. And yeah, spend a bit of time on that challenge. And as usual, we'll go through a walkthrough together in the final video of this section. That's it for now. I'll see you in the next one. Aside from attacking authentication mechanisms, we can also attack tokens themselves. This is to try and change our identity. For example, instead of being Jeremy the user, we might want to be Jessamy the admin. One of the requirements of REST APIs is statelessness. So this means that with each request, something needs to be sent to identify who actually sent the request. And usually that's a token, such as a session ID or JSON web token. Now, we'll look into attacking JWTs a little bit later on in the next video, but for now, let's take a look at how we can analyze tokens to get a better understanding of how random or secure they are. All right, so if I just come into my labs folder, you can see that I have the API token analysis.zip. So I'm just gonna come in and unzip this, clear my screen, and then cd into API token analysis. So we can see that there's some Docker files, so I'll just sudo docker compose build. Looks like we're all good. And then sudo docker compose up. And while it's doing that, I'm also going to open up Burp Suite. So Community Edition is fine because we're just going to use the sequencer for our analysis. And then I'm also going to open up, Firefox as well. We get a little bit of a message, but we'll just click OK for now. And then we can browse to localhost 9000. So if I just come in and hit login, and the username and password is the same as the last lab, so the password is Ramirez, so I just cut that, paste it in here, and click login. Now before we do this, I'm just going to have a quick look to see whether I have any cookies set, which I don't, so this is my cookie editor, and you can also do this in the console as well, so we can just type document.cookie to verify that we have indeed no cookies. So if you have some cookies set from the previous lab, then you can clear them out. So yeah, back to the login, admin Ramirez, and I hit login. And you see that we get this message that says you have successfully logged in. And if we click OK, we can then come back up to our cookie editor and we can see that we have an access token and we get a welcome admin as well. And same in the console, document.cookie, we have access equals, and this is indeed our cookie. So next up is to come over to Burp Suite, and we're just going to come over to proxy, HTTP history, and then we're going to come down and get the post request that was sent to get our cookie. So let me just move myself out of the way. And you can see that we sent the email and password, and we got a token back in the response. And this is what we need for sequencer. So whenever you find an endpoint that returns a token to you, you can use this for the sequencer or for this attack or analysis. So I'm just going to right click on the request, send to sequencer, click on sequencer, and before we start the live capture, we actually need to tell it where to find the token. So we just hit configure, and then we can highlight the token in here, and you can see that it automatically says, hey, the start of the token begins with quotes, token, quote, colon, quotes, and anything between this and the end, which is quotes, close braces, is our token. So it knows how to basically grep for the token on each request. And then all we need to do is start live capture. Now, if you're doing this against a live website, this is going to send thousands and thousands of requests. So make sure you're authorized to do it, and make sure that, you know, if it's against a production system, it can stand up to this kind of brute force. So obviously we're doing a local host, so it's going to be really fast. Again, a live host could take an hour to get through this many requests, could take shorter, longer. There are many variables. So 20,000 tokens, it's collected, and we can click Analyze Now, and you can see it gives us some results. So it says the overall quality of randomness within this sample is estimated to be extremely poor. So this is grounds for further inspection or further analysis. If you saw that the quality of randomness was incredibly amazing, you'd be like, this is probably not an attack vector unless there is something that you know about the token that maybe is overlooked by this tool. So if we come to character analysis, now this is quite interesting because I actually know how this token is created, and I know how it's formed because I wrote the code that did it. And this is not an accurate representation of the token. And this is a trap that I've seen a few people fall into before. The token we get back, if we inspect it or if we look at it a little bit more closely, you might think, looks like base 64. And sometimes if the padding's wrong, then you'll have equals on the end. And if we copy this and just open up, a new terminal page and just echo -n this to base 64-d, you'll see that, it is indeed base 64. And interesting that, we can come in and start to make some guesses as to what this is. Another way to do this is simply if we head over to Burp Suite, decoder, decode as base 64. And if you think it's, if you're doing a CTF or if you think it's something like completely strange, if you just come to Google and then CyberChef, I think it's cyberchef.io. Yeah, this is the one. You can paste it in here and, if you search for base, you've got like from base 32, for example, from base 45 and combinations of them. So you can really dive deep into the string from here. But in most cases, it will be base 64. Now, there's an easy way to combat this. Analysis options, base 64 decode string before analyzing, and then we can come back and hit analyze now. Now, if we save the tokens, let's say it's base 32 encoded, we could save the tokens, decode them, and then just load them in and analyze them that way. So if we have a set of tokens, we can still use the sequencer, but often we just do a quick base 64 decode and we're good to go. And now this is the analysis that I was expecting. So there's very little randomness between characters 0 through 14, and a lot of randomness between 15, 16, and 17. So this is really weak because it just means that in terms of our attack, instead of trying to brute force 17, 18 characters, we only need to brute force the last 3 characters. And looking at the token itself, it looks like the first 5 characters are the username. So it's likely that our token, when we're trying to brute force, will be Jeremy. And having a look at this, this looks like a time date stamp. So this looks like hours, minutes, and seconds. And I suspect what we can do is if we save the tokens and we save it to somewhere normal, let's just go into temp and I save it as tokens.txt and I come back and let's just head -n the top 100. We're in the wrong place. Let's cd temp head -n 100. Oops, that's 1000. Tokens.txt. We can see that obviously the first part of the token is the same every time, and then the end is slightly different, and this is from the base 64. Obviously we want to see this decoded, so again there's a few ways to do this. So I'm just going to copy and paste and then come back to Burp Suite and come to decoder, paste it in, and you can see indeed that we have 3 lowercase characters at the end of every token. And if I come back and let's say I grab tail, tacan, let's say 10 of tokens.txt, I want to grab the last few and compare them to basically the first few. So if I just come here and remove a bunch of these and paste in here, you can see the timestamp changes. Now, apologies if the text is a little bit small, but we've got 10, 38, 15, and 10:38:21. So this looks like the seconds that are ticking up. But obviously, because our requests were very fast, we got quite a lot of tokens for each second that passed. All right, so now we know that the start of the token is the username, the middle of the token is the timestamp, and the end of the token is 3 random characters. I have a challenge for you. Now, because this lab is created for learning purposes, I made it so that when the admin logs in, Jeremy also logs in. So you can use that information to figure out the timestamp or a very rough time of when Jeremy is about to log in. Obviously, if this was a real situation and the token was created by a timestamp, we'd have to find other ways to figure out when the user logged in. Maybe on their profile, it gives them a last online time, or maybe we just need to create a much wider array of tokens so that we cover, a few hours of the day when a user is likely to log in. It's very situational. But one last thing, don't forget that we learned how to brute force a couple of videos ago, so obviously you'll need to utilize those skills here. And as usual, we'll walk through the challenge together at the end of the section. So see if you can have a play with the token, decode it, understand how it's built, generate a bunch of tokens that you think might be legitimate for the user Jeremy, and then try and brute force the application to log in as Jeremy. And once you have the right token and refresh the homepage, if I can find it, you should have a welcome message that says, "Welcome Jeremy." So have a go at that, and I'll catch you in the next video. If you're working with web applications, it's likely that you've run into JSON Web Tokens, also known as JWTs. They're widely used with APIs and a great solution if you need a token that's flexible and secure. Although, as with most things, only if they're implemented securely. We're going to take a look at what JSON Web Tokens look like and some of the common attacks we can employ against them. After that, I'm going to give you some great free resources to further your study. So let's dive in and take a look at what JWTs actually look like. There are 3 parts: the header, the payload, and the signature. Each part is encoded with base 64 and separated by a full stop. Now, we can easily decode each piece to see the contents, but there is also a great tool that we can use at JWT.io to do this as well. When we take a closer look, we can see that the header contains some metadata about the token. The payload contains what we call claims, and these are pieces of information that we want to store about the bearer of the token or the person who supplied it. For example, we might want to store their username here. Now the signature contains just that, a signature. Now there are a bunch of different ways to sign a JWT, a JSON Web Token. For example, we can use symmetric encryption with just one secret to sign and verify. Or we can use asymmetric encryption, so we can sign with a private key and then use a public key to verify it. One last thing to note is that when we're transferring JWTs, we send them via the authorization header. So this will look something like authorization : bearer, and then the token value. Before we dive into attacking the tokens, let's take a quick look at what happens when we try to tamper with a signed token. So I'm just going to quickly spin up the web server for the example. So cd dev jwt demo and node server.js. So here I have a small web application that will basically issue and read JSON Web Tokens. So I'm just going to make a request to the server. So curl post to the /login endpoint, and you can see we're providing JSON, and the username is user and the password is user in this case. And we get back a valid token. If we pass the wrong username and password, we get username and password you provided are invalid. So what I want to do is quickly test this token. So I'm going to access the dashboard by making a GET request to /dashboard, and then I'm going to send the token that was provided previously from the login. And we get welcome to your dashboard user. Now, if I change this token or break it in some way, so I'm just going to quickly remove a character and send this, you'll see that we get JSON Web Token error, invalid signature. So let's take a quicker look. Let's take a closer look at this token in jwt.io. So what I do is I come to jwt.io, paste in the signature, and then you can see that the algorithm type is HS256 and the type is JWT. So this is our header. You can see that in the payload section, we have a user ID of user and we have an issued at time. And this is the timestamp for the token for when it was issued. Often you'll see things like expiry and maybe some user properties and some other things in here as well. And here we have the signature in the last section. Now, if we don't know the secrets, we can sign this with anything like I don't know 123, and you can see that the signature changes. So what I actually want to do is instead of being the user, I want to be the admin. So I'm just going to update this token, copy it, come back to here. Let me just clear this so you can see a little bit better. And then I'm going to paste this token in. So if the signature is not verified, then this should just return a message saying, hey, welcome to your dashboard admin, as it did with the user. But unfortunately, it seems like we actually have an invalid signature. So we need to know the secret before we can sign this. So I know that the secret used for this application is actually secret123. And if I just do head-n, it's probably within the top 5 lines of server.js, you can see that we have const secret123. So obviously, usually we wouldn't have access to this, but just so you can see how it works, if I come back in here and I change the signature so that it's signed with secret123, and then I copy this and I send the same request, but with the updated token, we get welcome to your dashboard admin. So you can see how the signature prevents tampering, but of course, if you sign it with a weak secret, then potentially your token can be forged, or we can create new tokens as we please and sign them. What we're going to do is in the next video, we'll look at how we can actually attack the token to try and extract a weak secret. And then we'll have a look at some other attacks after that in the following video. So I'll see you there. We know that sometimes the secret used for signing a JWT is weak. Coupled with the fact that we can perform this attack offline against just a single token makes it a really important test to carry out. Now, of course, if you have access to source code or are in direct contact with the developers of an application, this is an easy thing to audit. But often we're attacking from the outside, so we may not be privy to how the application creates and handles its secrets. You can use JWT tool to carry out this attack, but Hashcat is a little bit more effective for cracking. We'll look more at JWT tool and its capabilities in the next video. Alright, so we're just going to quickly demo how we can use Hashcat to crack this token and extract the secret. So same as before, I'm just going to send a post request to /login. It's going to have some JSON data, and the username is user and the password is user as well. And this gives us a valid token. Of course, your target application, usually when you log in, the response will have a token, so you can just take it out of Burp Suite or take it from your cookies. You know, there's lots of ways to get your hands on a token. So next up, we just go hashcat, and then, oops, I want the attack mode to be a dictionary attack, so that's -A0. If you want to brute force without a dictionary, I think it's -A3. And then the mode is 16500 for JWTs. So I'm just going to paste the token. Of course, you could save this to a file and then just reference the file, but I'm just going to paste it in for now. And then I'm just going to use Rocky for this. And then we can see it's loading up and it's done already. That was faster than I expected, actually. So you can see the status is cracked. If it got through the whole word list and couldn't find it, it would say exhausted. And that might be an indication that you either need to use a different word list or more targeted word list, or potentially switch to brute force mode and leave it running for a few hours. But you'll see that we don't actually see the password here. So all we need to do is come back, hit --show, and then it will reveal to us the password. So very weak, 6 characters, and the entropy is not very high. What I mean by entropy is the character set. So here we only have lowercase characters and a number. If you have high entropy, you might include uppercase characters, special characters, things like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this token again, and then we're going to come over to jwt.io, and then the same as before, we're going to use this as the secret. I'm just going to change this to admin, whoops, paste in the secret, copy this forged token, and then I'm just going to make a request to the dashboard with my new token. So curl tac I http localhost dashboard, and then we just want to pass the header authorization bearer, and then we post in our token. And we have welcome to your dashboard admin. And that's it. So obviously, if a JWT is signed with a weak key, we can crack it and then forge our own tokens, as we've seen a couple of times. In the next video, we'll look at some other misconfigurations and how we can identify them with JWT tool. And then we will walk through some of the challenges that we've had so far in this module. I'll see you there. All right, let's get started with JWT tool. So if you don't have it already installed, you can come over to the GitHub repository, and I already have this open. But if you're on the homepage of the GitHub repo, you can come down to setup.txt, and there are some setup instructions here ready to go that will get you up and running. Now, with my setup, I just added one more extra command. I put a link between the opt jwt tool.py, which is the tool itself, and I just created a link in this directory, which is in my path, so I can access this direct JWT tool directly with JWT tool rather than having to go /opt/JWT tool or jwt tool.py, for example. So feel free to set up your environment however you want. So if we just type JWT tool and hit enter, we get the usage information, which is super helpful. And if we just, to begin with, grab a token and pass it in, it's going to give us some information about it. So for this demo, I think what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at our friend Crappy, and then I'm just going to log in quickly. And I'm just going to open up Web Suite as well so that I can capture the token, although you could grab it from the developer tools. Just going to hit next, start Web Suite. And hit OK. And proxy, HTTP history. And I'm going to come back and switch on my proxy and log in with any account that you've created. I'm just going to use a@tcmsec.com that we created in a previous video. Click login, and yeah, our Lamborghini is back, which is nice. So I'm just going to come back to here and have a look at the requests. So this is our initial post, and then we've also got some GET requests to API v2 user dashboard as well. Just close this. Make this a little bit easier to see. You can see we have our token here, authorization bearer, and the token itself. So I'm just going to grab this, and then I'm going to come back to JWT tool. Whoops, I clearly didn't copy it. I think I hit Control-Shift-C, which is copying from the terminal rather than application. Hit enter, and it gives us basically the same information that JWT.io would give us. So if I just grab this and pop it in here, you can see the algorithm and the payloads, the header, which contains the algorithm and the payload data. And you can also basically see the same thing here. But if you prefer working in the terminal and you don't want to switch out to jwt.io, then this is a good way of quickly having a look at a token. Or if you're passing in lots of tokens and you're scripting something, this is a good way to pass in a lot of data and grep for stuff coming out, or for example. So we can see sub is a@tcmsec.com, the role is user, and the issued at time and the expiry time as well. So what I want to do next is I'm just going to do JWT, the same thing, JWT tool, and then I'm going to pass, let me move myself out of the way, -T, so you can see this. So what this does is this allows us to modify a token. So you can see here we have the algorithm RS256. Now with the header we can add a value, delete a value, or continue to next step. So let's just continue. I want to add something into the payload. So here we are in the payload section, and I want to add something. So let's do 5, and I want to add, I don't know, and the value is, I don't know, just for example. And then we want to continue to the next step. And then because we don't actually have the private key to sign this, and if you notice the key is RS256, so this is asymmetric encryption. The signature is unchanged, so no signing method specified. So we haven't re-signed the token. So I suspect when we use this, we will get a signature invalid. But this is a way of modifying tokens if you prefer to be in the terminal, if that makes sense. Now what we want to do next is take a look at JWT, tool, help, and have a look at some of the things that we can do. So what we want to look at is the -M mode. So we can actually audit tokens. So we can do playbook audits, fuzz existing claims to force errors, fuzz common claims to see whether we get different results, or we can do all tests. Now, since Crappy is running locally and it's not a production system, I'm not going to break anything, why not just go ahead and do all tests? So to do this, we need a couple of things. So we're going to do JWT tool, and we need a target. So what I'm going to do is use the same endpoint as before. So this identity API v2 user dashboard. And it's important that the target processes the token in some way and gives back different results. So for example, if we provided a different token or no token at all, let's demonstrate this quickly in repeater. So I send this and I get the information back. If I don't provide a token, we get a different response. If you use an endpoint that doesn't process the token, or the response doesn't change based on your input, then you're not going to get any results, is basically what I mean. So a help page or an about page, for example, might not check whether you have a JWT. So I'm going to paste this in here, and obviously I need to do http://localhost, and then it's 8888, I think, if I recall. And then what we need next is the authorization header. So we actually need to pass in our token as a header. So same, you can copy this from Burp Suite, or you can just write it out. And then we want the authorization bearer. And actually, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this token, this whole thing, because I think that's probably the easiest way to do it. And then we want the mode. So if we come back up to our help file, we can see the mode here, and we're just going to do all tests. And also notice that there's also -x exploit, so we can try and exploit known vulnerabilities. And we get a load of data back. So let's go from top to bottom. So it does an initial test. So sending the token, and we get a 200 back, which is good. And then we do some pre-scan checks. So pre-scan original token and our response code, and we get 179 bytes back. And this is basically the content length of the response. So we can check this. If we come back to Burp Suite, we can see this is where I took the token from, and indeed here is the content length 179 and the data that comes back with it. So this is important to know because when we look at other requests, we want to see whether the content length has changed, and we also want to look at the response code. So the next check, no token, we get a 404 and 58 bytes, and we can verify this in Burp Suite by coming in here, deleting this, and we get a 404 and 58 bytes. So it's actually doing a lot of tests for us, and then if we want to, we can verify them manually. So broken signature response code 200,179. So this is a very interesting finding in that we get a 200 back, which, yeah, that seems okay, but the bytes, the content length matches. And again, we can come back and verify this by breaking our signature. So I'm just going to remove some data out of this, and we still get the same response. And this is really interesting. This says to me that, hey, the application is not checking the signature, or it's not verifying the data that we're sending. And we need to do some further testing. So that's a really interesting finding right off the bat. And what it's now doing is repeating the original token. So it's just checking that even after sending broken or different tokens, can we still use the original token? So some systems or some web applications may give you a new token each time you send a request, for example. All right, so launching the JWT attack playbook, we basically do the same as what we just kind of talked through. We look at what it did, we look at the response code, we look at the content length, and then we think to ourselves, is this normal behavior based on what I know about the endpoints? And if it isn't, or if we need to verify it, we can come into Burp Suite and we can verify the behavior. So reading down these, if you're not sure what any of them are, you can actually come over to the JWT tool. And then if you scroll all the way down, and I definitely recommend you do this as kind of like extra study, keep going all the way down to the bottom. We have the JWT attack book for a detailed run through of JWT attacks. So in here, there's like a bit of a primer, which we've probably already covered quite a lot of already. Attack methodology, vulnerable claims, known exploits, finding public keys, tampering, fuzzing, stealing JWTs, using JWT tools. So you can use this in conjunction with your findings. So if it flags and says, hey, you might be vulnerable to CVE 2015 9235 ALG non-attack, which when we go back, we actually see here that we get a valid response and the same content length for ALG non. So this is a super interesting finding. You can come in here and read more about the attack and how the attack works, how to replicate it, and how to pull it off. So consider this your homework if you want to understand and learn more about JWT attacks. This is definitely a great place to go. One other place that actually I'll mention since we're here already, of course, is the Portswigger Web Security Academy. And if we come in here and go to Academy, and then I think we can just do all labs. Search for JWT, and there's a load of labs for expanding your knowledge on JSON Web Token attacks as well. So a couple of resources to keep your study going. So let's explore this. And actually, I want to also show off a very useful plugin. So if you come over to Burp Suite, click Extender, App Store, and just search for JWT, of course, we have this JWT editor. And then there are a few other plugins that you can explore as well, but I'm just going to install this one. Only takes a second to install. And there's a couple of things that you should notice is that if we clear our history and we come back to our application, and let's say I'm just going to log back in again. Oh, I really want a Lamborghini. You can see that it's actually, now it's active, it's highlighting automatically in green posts that include our JWT. So we can really quickly map an application and have a look for endpoints that do or don't require a JSON web token to access, or they're being passed within those requests. Next up, we can come back to the repeater, and we can see that we have a JSON web token tab, and we can see, it decodes the token for us nicely, and we can quickly have a look and inspect the token. So since we're investigating, the non attack, the alg non, I can come in here and I can just click attack, and I can click non-signed algorithm. And you can see that it's changed the header for me, the algorithm has changed to none, and I can hit send. And we do indeed still get back our user data. So this is very interesting. You notice that the signature is missing from this token. So what I want to do now is, an interesting quirk of this is that the tab disappears. I'm not sure if this is a bug, but there's a way to fix this. So if you come to here, send this back to repeater, hit send initially, and then edit your token. And then if we do none, and then send this again, you see that it disappears. But when we click the back to restore our original token, it comes back again. So I'm not sure if it's intended functionality, but yeah, make sure you just send an initial request before editing the token. So what I actually want to do here is test whether we can change this to none and see whether we can see a different user. So I think the user B exists, and then we can hit send. The given email is not registered. So let's come back to here. I think we know that the community page does leak some data. So let's come back to Burp Suite. We could also just create an account, but we can very quickly just find an email address here. So I'm just going to copy this. Paste. And we can indeed request information from other accounts. So note that we need their email address, but now we're leaking their phone number. And if they had a video available and some other information like their available credit is also leaked. And their picture URL, not sure if this is private or not, but maybe it would give us the full path to their picture. Now, interesting that actually I just demonstrated this attack and I did not switch the non-signing algorithm attack on. So actually, this seems like even though it's flagged as algorithm none, I suspect the issue is that the JSON web token is being passed and the response is being generated and sent back without checking the signature. Now this happens a lot when, for example, if you're using Node and you use the function decode instead of verify, you can pass a JSON web token without a valid signature and it will still process it. So when you're reporting this issue, the attack actually isn't the non-signing algorithm attack, it's actually just the fact that we're not checking the signature at all. At least that's what appears to be happening in this case. So that's it for JWT tool. Now I hope this got you off to a good start with JWTs and how we can attack them. As I mentioned before, definitely consider furthering your study, maybe after you finish this course, in areas that are relevant to you and your day-to-day work. In the next section, we'll walk through some of the challenges and then move on. See you there. All right, welcome to the final video of this section. Now, I'm really excited because you've made great progress so far, and it's a real honor for me to be able to support you on your journey. So let's take a look at the two challenges from earlier in this section. First, we'll find a way to brute force the second user from the brute force me application. And we'll do this with both Burp Suite and FFUF. And then we'll look at the Analyze Me challenge so that we can forge a token and log in as Jeremy on the second application. Let's dive straight in. So here I have the brute force me application up and running. And if we just come to login, and all I'm going to do is do Alex, and then double check that my proxy is on, which it is, and just click login, and we get invalid username. All right, so I'll close this, and then I'll come over to Burp Suite, proxy, HTTP history, and we can see the post request to /v1/verify. And if we have a look, we can see the username, which, apologies, yeah, it's still marked as email. When I update the labs, I'll get around to changing this. Originally, I was using email addresses, but then changed my mind for some reason. Forgot to update the attribute name. And we have the password as Alex, and we come back with invalid username. So let's just send this to intruder with Control-I, or you can right-click and click Send to Intruder. And what we want to do is first clear the selections, and we just want to add one on the username. So to begin with, we want to try and find the relevant username. So here, I'm going to think about what payload I want to use. So I know that there are some names in user share sequelists, names, here we are. And we have a few different to choose from. So we have family names USA, female names, forenames India, male names USA, and names.txt. And I think if we just check the length of this, just make sure it's not too long. 10,100, so that should be okay. I think we'll go with this names.txt. So load, and then we'll come back up to usernames, names, names.txt, and we'll hit start attack. And of course we're running locally, so it's not going to take too long to get through all of the 10,000 requests, and it's done. So first thing we want to check for is the status code. Everything is a 401, so unfortunately that's not going to give us a hint. And the next thing to check is the length, and as we can see, these two have a slightly different length. So it looks like admin, if we check the response, has invalid password, and Jeremy also has invalid password. Now notice the response length is very close, and actually if we take a little look at this, we can see that if we'd had a more consistent and better developer other than myself, the response lengths actually might have been the same, with the inconsistency here being the exclamation mark. Now, if we couldn't find these, but we had an inkling that they might be in there, we go through a big list and we're like, no results, really? We might want to do something, for example, is take the normal, something that comes back in the response of the usual response, come up to filter, paste this in here, and do a negative search. So we want to search for everything that doesn't have the string invalid username. And when we press that, we get admin and Jeremy. So if we were tricked and the content length was the same, then yeah, this is a way to find responses. So don't just rely on status codes and length. I think a lot of people, a lot of security practitioners get a little bit frustrated when brute forcing doesn't work out, but there is technique to brute forcing. It is a skill, and it's a skill that you really need to learn. So, don't get frustrated, hang in there, and try and work methodically. So we have the user Jeremy, and I think we can just close this, discard that, and come back to the application, and come Jeremy, hit login, and of course we get the invalid password. So we'll come back to Burp Suite, grab this. I could just update the intruder setup that we have already, but I'm just going to create a new one. I like to separate my workspaces so that if I need to go back, then I can go back and make changes. Add the payload field to this, and then think about the payloads. And again, we need to think about what password list we might want to use. So if we just ls user share sequelists passwords, and there's quite a lot of lists here. So Rocky is not too bad. Occasionally I use this Dark Web 2017, but more often than not I've found it not to be that useful. The Zato one is not too bad. I think the best thing to do is think about what your target is, what you're trying to brute force, and then think about a combination of lists that might help. And to be honest, even with a little bit of Linux command line, not even that complicated, you could easily curate your own list that you can use in different situations, and that's probably going to be much more successful than just using a single list. So let's try the Zato top 10,000, I think, to begin with. We'll just load, come back up, passwords, and then 10,000 is a good place to start. Doesn't take too long, and we can see where we're at. And let's check for status codes, and unfortunately we didn't find it, and we'll just check the length for good measure as well. So we should get a login if we find the valid one. So in this case, I'm pretty confident that we didn't find the password based on the status code. So let's discard this, clear the list, load it up again, and we have a choice. Maybe we could go for a longer list. So we could go for this top 100,000, or we could go for a different list. So let's try the Dark Web top 10,000, because it's only going to take a few seconds to check. Still nothing, so let's discard this, clear. Let's step up to a bigger list. This one's going to take a little bit longer to run. All right, so we can take a quick look, and we got lucky. So on the 99,973rd request, we got a status 200. Interesting that the password is just a number. So let's actually have a quick look to see whether. So cat, user, share, word lists, Rocky, grep. It is in Rocky, so we would have found it. Although Rocky is 14 million and this was just 100,000, so would probably be here for the next hour if we were just using the Rocky word list, which is why I generally avoid using Rocky on online brute forcing unless I really have to use it. I mean, every situation is different, right? So we just click login and success. Here is your flag, and we get our flag and a pat on the back. So that's our brute force challenge done. And I can close this, and let's try and do the same thing again, but with FFUF. So I'll just clear this quickly. So we'll just come into our temp directory, and what I want to do is grab a request from burp. So let's grab the invalid one and work from that, because that's more realistic. So we're going to delete the old one that we had from the previous video, and then we're just going to vim rec.txt, pop this in, and then first of all we want to do the username. So I'm just going to put fuzz in here, save and close, clear, and then request rec, and then request proto http, and then our word list, user, share, sucklists, usernames, names, names.txt, and then we want to ignore 401s. So if we run this, we can see that we get tons and tons of 401 errors or 401 responses. So we can do this by doing fc 401, and we can also, if we want to filter out the size, I think it's fs, and we'd put in 30, for example. Since we're going for the username in this case, we actually want to get rid of the size of 30 and filter that out. That's correct, sorry, because the response is still going to be 401. And as you can see, we get admin and Jeremy. Now in the next attack, so let's update our payload. So we have Jeremy, and then the password is going to be fuzz, and then we're going to send the same one, but we're going to filter out 401s, and we're going to update the payload to passwords. And which list was it? It was the Zato, and it was a big one, so top 100,000, I think. And the nice thing about FFUF is that it's a little bit faster than Bub Suite, so should go a little bit quicker. Although, oh wow, a lot quicker. Yeah, this tool never fails to impress, and even though I've used it a lot, I'm always surprised by the speed. So it's found a status code 200 with this payload. And again, we can verify this by going to login, Jeremy, paste in the password, and we get our flags. So again, knowing the tools that we're going to use, knowing how to filter results and pass them correctly is going to be really, really important for your AppSec journey in general, but also with hacking APIs. All right, so here we are in API token analysis. So sudo docker compose up, and we'll come to our browser. I've already got Bub Suite running, and then just localhost 9000. And we just want to double check. Yeah, there's no cookies or anything that are going to mess with us. So if we recall, we remember from the previous video, we'll remember that the token is the username dash timestamp dash 3 random characters. And the timestamp would also pose an issue, but I think I already shared the hints that Jeremy logs in at the same time as the admin, so in this scenario. And so if we just log in, and I think the password is Ramirez, and yeah, we get successfully logged in, and we get welcome admin. So let's come back to here and go proxy, HTTP history is our post, and we get our token back. And we can see in the subsequent GET request, we have access equals this token. So let's take this token. I'm going to copy it, send it to the decoder. Decoder's base 64, and here we have our token. Now, how are we going to go about building a payload? So if we send this to the intruder, Control I, and then what we want to do is, sorry, that's the wrong one. If we send the GET request to the intruder, Control I, we actually need to be able to either have a list of tokens ready to go, or what we can do sometimes is just replace like individual values, for example. But then if we were to replace these individual values, we then need to base 64 encode the token. So there's a few different ways to solve this, but I think the easiest way is for us to just create a list of tokens that we can load in and attack the application with. So let's go ahead and do that with Python. And here scripting skills are obviously helpful. So if I just vim, let's call this tokens.py. And instead of vim, let's use mousepad as an alternative, and it might be a little bit easier to work with if I'm moving around and making adjustments. Now, we could use iter tools, but I can't remember exactly how to use them. So instead of doing that, what we want to do is let's import base64. Oops. And we also want our character set. So this is going to be, oops, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, whoops, Q, R, S, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. I'm sure some people can type that a lot faster than I can. In fact, I probably should have just gone along the keyboard and done a keyboard walk, but you know, it's fine. Whatever works. And we also want the prefix to be this as well. And note that we don't need to brute force the timestamp because we know that Jeremy logs in the same time as admin. Although if we relog in as admin, it may reset that token. So just be aware of that. So yeah, instead of using iter tools, I think we're just going to use for I in range, and we'll just do the length of the characters, and we're just going to nest some loops. I'm just going to use spaces for now because the tab inside of here is crazy. And then for j in range, and we'll just do the len again of characters. And if you don't want to watch me code this out, feel free to skip forward. I'm just basically going to make 3 loops, nested loops, so that we iterate through all of the permutations that can be generated. That's not a very good explanation. And actually, I'm going to create a list, so I'm just going to call perms equals, and then I'm just going to do bracket bracket. And here, we're going to do perms.append, and then we're just going to add cars I plus cars j plus cars k, and then we should be good. We need the prefix. So prefix plus this, and then at the end, once it's done that, we can do for perm in perms. Oh god, this keyboard is crazy. I changed my keyboard recently, unfortunately. Print perm. So let's just have a look, and then we need to base 64 encode, and I can't remember how to do that off the top of my head. So I can't remember. So what we'll do actually is we'll use a burp suite option. I'm just going to leave it for now because we'll need it later on. But in the payloads here, you can see payload processing, and we can add a rule to encode our payload. So let's just use that for the time being, and we'll do this again in a second. So I just save this, and let's just close it, and then Python 3 tokens.py. Looks like that worked successfully. So let's do the same again and just output this to tokens.text, and then come back into burp suite and load in. We'll go to home, Kali, where were we? We were in temp, and then we have tokens.text, and here we have all of our tokens. And actually we made a mistake, or I say I made a mistake. This needs to be Jeremy, not admin, before I do that. So I'm just going to overwrite the tokens file, clear these, load it again. Whoops, I loaded the Python file. So tokens.text, and we have our Jeremy tokens. All right, and let's add our payload processing. So we want to encode, and then we want to base 64 encode, and click OK, and let's start the attack. You can see we have about 35,000 items in our attack. What I want to look for is different length. All right, looks like I messed it up. So let me clear this quickly, reset the payload position, sorry about that, and start the attack again. So here, yeah, because I only set one payload position, we have much less requests, fewer requests. And then we can go and check the length. And we can see that, yeah, so sending a blank request obviously had a different length to an invalid token, but we can see request 3800 with this one here. So I'm just going to copy this. And if we actually look at the response, we can just see, welcome Jeremy, and says, hey, nice work, your flag is TCM, do. And we can verify this, so we can just update our access token here. Note that the percentage 3D are just equal signs, so I think this should work because that's just URL encoding. So let's try. Yeah, we get welcome Jeremy, and we get our flag. So here, I think if you do see something like this, it's probably also going to work. Yeah, so we're all good. It's just a little bit of URL encoding quirks there. All right, so next up, we need to update our code quickly so that we have base 64, and then we're going to pass it into FFUF. So mousepad tokens.py, and I realize actually this text is really small, so sorry about that if you were looking at that earlier. And then we've already imported base64, so what we can do is just do base64.encode, and I think it's base64.b64 encode, like this, and then we do .encode here, if I recall. Let's try it. Let's just run it and see. We get an error. My brackets are off. So let's try this again. All right, that looks like what we want, but it is a byte string, so I just did a quick Google, and yeah, I just need to add the decode, which I'd totally forgotten about. So if we have this here, and then we have encode.decode. Wait, no. .decode here, we should be good to go. All right. So let's put this out to tokens.text, and then let's do FFUF again. So we want to do FFUF-request, and then we need our request.txt, so let's grab that. Oops. So rm rec.txt, vim rec.txt, insert this, and here we want to fuzz this request, and then fuf-request request.txt, and then request, proto http, and then -w, we want tokens.txt, and then we also, I'm going to run it for a second, and then we're going to look at the response length, and then we're going to filter out the response length. So if I just cancel this very quickly, and then the size here, we're just going to grab 384, and then we're just going to do -fc, sorry, 834, not 384. Oops, that didn't work. Oh, it's fs, not fc. There we go. And we got it here, so this looks like our token. So let's just check it. So we can echo -n and then echo this to base64-t code. So fqd looks like the same one as last time, but what we'll do is we'll just remove this, refresh the page, we're not logged in, add a token, call it access, hit save, refresh the page, and we've solved this lab. Good job. So, sorry that might have been a little bit jittery along the way, but hopefully you got some insight into my troubleshooting process when I'm working on web applications. And that's it for this module. Authentication is not an easy topic and there's still a lot to learn, but I really hope that you've gotten a good foundation that you can continue to expand on. Great job, and I'll see you in the next section.